I'd like to talk about ethics under three headings, really, and they're all in different ways responses to modernity. The first heading is what I call universal ethics, and the second heading is what I call subversive ethics, and the third is what I call ecclesial ethics. And it's fairly easy to tell the difference between the three because it's really about who their audience is, who their constituency is, who the proponents of those different kinds of ethics really think ethics is actually for. The proponents of universal ethics think that ethics is for everyone. It more or less takes for granted that everybody in the world is the same, always has been, always will be. And so if you're trying to find an ethic of human behavior, then you have to start with everybody. Subversive ethics is somewhat different. Subversive ethics starts from the point that the everybody presumed by universal ethics isn't really everybody. It has tended to be historically the white, the male, the Western, often these days people would say the heterosexual, that it's got a particular social location. And those people have always felt they spoke for everybody. If you think back to the days when people used the word mankind as if it meant everybody, or even used the word man or men as if it meant everybody, that change has been made in the last 20 or 30 years, that people don't often use the word men, meaning everybody. You know, Declaration of the Rights of Man, we would feel uncomfortable with a phrase like that these days, but actually nobody batted an eyelid 30 years ago about using man in that sense. Well, that's been the work of, if you like, what I would call subversive ethics. It's located that so-called universal and said, well, it's not actually really universal at all. And there are different kinds of subversive ethics, which we can talk about in a moment. And then the third kind is ecclesial ethics. So subversive ethics is ethics for the excluded, for the marginalized, for the people who don't belong in that so-called universal. And then the third kind is ecclesial ethics. And ecclesial ethics at its best hears the subversive critique of universal ethics, but tends to look at subversive ethics and say, well, you know, the critique's great and very appropriate, but actually where is the constructive account? Why should one still be a Christian if one has taken such a savage attack on what Christianity has often been perceived to be? So ecclesial ethics says, well, we may or may not be able to make statements that apply for the whole world, but the heart of Christian ethics is what applies to Christians. Now, they may commend themselves. Others might say, what a wonderful thought. Others might say, see how these Christians love one another. That's our aspiration. But at the least, we should get our own house in order. We should make our living of the gospel the shop window, if you like, rather than assume from the outset that what Christ has said or what we find in the Ten Commandments apply to the whole world before we've even looked at the nuances of what such a statement might mean. So that's a little bit about the distinctions between universal, subversive, and ecclesial ethics. Universal for everybody, subversive for the excluded and marginalized, and ecclesial for the church. So let's start with universal ethics. And there are different kinds of universal ethics, and I'm going to talk really about three. One is what I would call divine command, the assumption, particularly rooted in people's understandings of the Ten Commandments and of the Jewish law, that God has spoken, and if you like, God has had the last word. God has laid down the law, and it's the law not just for the Israelites as they read the Old Testament through the years, the 1,000 years before Christ, but also for everybody. And that's in a sense that there are some things that are just right and just wrong, that God laid them down at a particular moment in history, gave us all the answers, if you like, and if we're finding life difficult now, or if we're in dispute right now, it's because we haven't scurried back and actually found the exact words of God to explain every difficult ethical problem. That's divine command ethics. And there are two other kinds of this kind of universal ethics. The second is what we would call natural law ethics. And natural law ethics is more associated with the Roman Catholic tradition, although it's found in other traditions. And that more or less says that God has written into the orders of nature, into the orders of creation, how things should go. And our place in creation is fulfilled when we as human beings find that appropriate place between the image of God that is in us and our animal nature. Different people put the bar at different places along there, but somewhere between our uniqueness as being made in the image of God and our animal nature shared with all of creation is where we discover natural law. And often, I mean, this comes up in relation, for example, in the Roman Catholic Church in relation to issues such as contraception. The claim is sometimes made that every act of sexual intercourse, since for animals as for every act of sexual intercourse is open to procreation, therefore it should be for us, and any artificial forms of contraception are inappropriate. That's a natural law argument. You can't find that in the Ten Commandments, you can't find that in the Old Testament, but you can find that in a certain reading of natural law. And then the third distinctive kind is what's called the categorical imperative. Now, this was put together by Immanuel Kant in response to the religious wars of the 17th century, and he, reflecting on that experience more or less 100 years later, said that you have to have a certain kind of right and wrong that doesn't go back to tradition, but can be categorical, just in the very nature of the description. And he had a number of configurations, 3 configurations of the categorical imperative. Perhaps the best known is that goes, act so that the principle of your action should be a universal moral law. And I remember back to my primary school when I remember breaking the pencil of my neighbour in the class when I was very cross with him. And I remember the teacher saying to me, look, Sam, what if everybody did that? And what my teacher didn't know, but I now know all these years later, is that she was a Kantian, because that's exactly what Immanuel Kant would say. As soon as you say, what if everybody did that, you're saying something that no one would really have said before about 1790. When Immanuel Kant more or less said it for the first time. It's so second nature in our culture, we're all Kantians, as it's sometimes said, that we don't even realize that actually nobody said things like that. You don't find that sort of language, what if everybody did it? You don't find that in the New Testament. But we're so used to it that we don't realize we don't find it in the New Testament. We actually find it in Immanuel Kant. So those are 3 kinds of universal ethics. And set against those, the battle in universal ethics is usually with those 3, different formulations of those 3, set against the other kind of universal ethics. And the other kind of universal ethics is not so much about whether actions are right or wrong in themselves, or their motivations are right or wrong in themselves, but about their outcomes. And that's what's known as consequential ethics. And consequential ethics is arguably even more influential even than the 3 that I've already described, even Immanuel Kant, who is more or less in the water, in our mother's milk. Why is consequential ethics so significant? Well, I believe it appeals to our sense of, increasingly in modernity, our ability to control our environment. And so we evaluate the qualities of what we do or what we plan to do by their likely outcomes, assuming, and this is the crucial point, that we actually can control their likely outcomes. So if you think back to Barack Obama's speech when he was installed as, his inauguration speech when he was installed as President of the United States back in the beginning of 2009, in January 2009, in the face of this huge expectation of being the first African-American president, but also this growing panic that we all had in 2009, rightly so, as it turned out, about the state of the economy, he committed himself not to a Martin Luther King-style dream, but to what works. The phrase he used over and over again in that speech was what works. Well, what he was saying there is that he's a consequentialist. He's going to do what works. That's what consequentialism is. Now, Jeremy Bentham was the most famous consequentialist who was a utilitarian back at the beginning of the 19th century, and he devised a calculus, as he called it, a felicific calculus, a happiness calculus, that would determine in all circumstances what would work in terms of the greatest happiness of the greatest number. Now, that's a phrase you still hear in public life today. It's what people often don't realize, that the greatest happiness and the greatest number, and what if everybody did it, are actually contradictory. They're actually contradictory notions of ethics, but they're so widely used that I think most people in public life, I would say in all modesty, perhaps this is unfair, don't realize that they're actually contradictory versions of ethics. In my view, what they have in common is more than the ways in which they differ. And what they have in common is that they're both kinds of universal ethics. They assume that ethics is for everybody, and the neutral observer, and you have to be neutral, of course others would question whether there's such a thing as a neutral observer. Universal ethics presumes that there is such a thing as the neutral observer, and they can decide between ethics based on the right and wrong actions on the one hand, which is known as deontological ethics, and ethics based on likely outcomes of actions, which is consequential ethics. And those, with certain nuances, that's the field of universal ethics. I guess the only nuance which I might add to that would be that in the era of human rights, there's often a greater sense of social good in addition to individual. Now, universal ethics finds that a very, very difficult issue to deal with. It finds it extremely difficult to work out how it distinguishes between the language of rights, which is often very focused on individuals, and the well-being of the whole community. Now, if you think of the WikiLeaks issue, this is a classic of that kind. Free speech suggests that you shouldn't, nobody should be closed down. It's a right to free speech, and therefore if you have this scurrilous information about the CIA or whatever it might be, you should be allowed to put it on the internet. It seems very much a straightforward case of human rights. But if you think about the number of people who might lose their lives by you exercising that right to free speech, then that applies, that invokes a much wider social good, which advocates of human rights often find it quite difficult to come to terms with. And so things like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and a lot of Catholic social teaching that emerged from 1891 onwards up to the present day have focused